Daverkeln gripped the faded envelope in his hands, his thumb tracing the wax seal bearing his family's crest. The paper was brittle, the ink smudged from age, yet the words inside were as sharp as the blade of a knife. You are the last, Daver, the only one left to carry the burden. The mine belongs to you now, but be warned, what rests within is not meant to be disturbed. It is not gold. It is not silver. It is something far older, something our bloodline has kept hidden for centuries. If you value your life, turn away. Burn this letter. Forget this place. His grandfather's signature curled at the bottom of the page, stark and final. But Daver couldn't forget. The inheritance had come unexpectedly after his grandfather's passing, an unclaimed relic of an older time. No one in the family had spoken of the mine in decades. It was an unspoken rule to ignore it, to leave it buried beneath layers of history. But now, with the deed in his name and nothing tying him elsewhere, curiosity had led him here, to the isolated stretch of land where the mouth of the mine gaped like a hungry beast waiting to devour him whole. The old cabin, built generations ago, still stood at the mine's edge, its wooden beams warped from time and neglect. Dust coated the furniture inside, and the scent of aged parchment lingered in the air. His grandfather's journals lined the shelves, filled with cryptic entries about the mine. But they were fragmented, half-mad ramblings warning of an unnamed presence in the depths. Daver wasn't a man given to superstition. He had spent his life in the city, grounded in reality, unmoved by ghost stories or family legends. Yet standing before the mine's entrance, he couldn't deny the cold prickle running down his spine. With a deep breath, he adjusted his backpack, turned on his flashlight, and stepped inside. The darkness swallowed him whole. The deeper he went, the more the silence pressed against him. His footsteps echoed against stone, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. Old wooden beams supported the cavern walls, some sagging precariously, evidence of a structure on the brink of collapse. As he navigated the tunnels, his flashlight flickered across long-forgotten mining equipment, rusted pickaxes, overturned carts, shattered lanterns. Strange markings adorned the walls, symbols carved into the rock, their meaning lost to time. They were not the markings of miners. They were deliberate, purposeful. Warning signs, perhaps. Then he found it. A gate. It stood at the end of a tunnel, crafted from black iron, its surface covered in intricate engravings. Unlike everything else in the mine, it was intact, untouched by rust, undisturbed by time. A thick chain ran across its center, secured by a heavy padlock that looked far newer than the gate itself. Daver frowned. Someone had reinforced this. Recently, he ran his fingers over the chain. The metal was cold, almost unnaturally so. His mind whispered that this was where he should stop, that this was the boundary his grandfather had warned him not to cross. But he had never been one to obey warnings. With effort, he retrieved a crowbar from his backpack and wedged it beneath the padlock. It groaned under the pressure, then snapped open with a sharp crack. The chain unraveled, slithering to the ground like a dead serpent. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a cavern beyond. The air changed instantly. It was warmer here, tinged with an energy that made his skin prickle. The walls glowed faintly with blue light, emanating from clusters of crystalline formations embedded in the rock. The space was vast, natural rather than man-made, as if carved by some ancient force. And at its center, bound to the stone, was something impossible. A woman. No, something more than a woman. She was chained, her wrists and ankles secured by the same black iron as the gate. But she was unlike anything he had ever seen. Her skin shimmered in the dim glow, a deep indigo hue threaded with silver veins that pulsed faintly, as if carrying liquid stardust through her body. Her hair was not hair at all, but a shifting mass of luminescent tendrils that floated weightlessly around her face. She was tall, slender yet powerful, and despite her restraints, there was an air of quiet strength about her. Daver's breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful, otherworldly, and she was alive. He took a cautious step forward, his pulse hammering. "Hello!" First, she didn't react. Then, as if drawn by the sound of his voice, her eyelids fluttered open. Her eyes were pure silver, swirling with shifting light. They locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Then, without moving her lips, she spoke. "You are the first." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't spoken aloud, yet he heard it clearly in his mind. It resonated through him, an echo in his very bones. Davor took another step forward. "The first." Her gaze remained fixed on him. "The first to touch this place. The first to see me." His throat went dry. His grandfather had known about her. His ancestors had kept her here. But why? "Who are you?" he asked. A flicker of something passed through her expression. Sorrow, perhaps. Or relief. Vilessa. The name sent a strange warmth through him, as if it carried a power of its own. His eyes dropped to the chains binding her. They were thick, reinforced with strange etchings that pulsed faintly, similar to the symbols on the gate. He knelt, brushing his fingers against one of the restraints. It was warm, humming with a dormant energy that made his skin tingle. "How do I free you?" Vilessa hesitated, then spoke carefully. "The chains are bound to the will of your lineage. Only you may command them." Davor's mind reeled. His family had locked her here, and now he had the power to undo it. His instincts screamed at him to be cautious. He didn't know what she was, why she had been imprisoned, but the sight of her bound like this, it didn't sit right with him. Swallowing his doubts, he placed his hand on one of the restraints. "I will it." The response was immediate. A crack split through the air as the metal shattered, releasing a burst of blue energy that dissipated into the cavern. Vilessa inhaled sharply, her body shuddering as if some unseen weight had lifted from her. One by one, he repeated the process. With each broken chain, the cavern trembled, as if the mine itself was protesting. Finally, the last restraint fell away. Vilessa slumped forward, and before she could collapse, Davor caught her. Her body was warm, impossibly so, and as she leaned against him, he felt a pulse of energy flow between them, something ancient and unfamiliar. She exhaled, her fingers clutching at his shirt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then her voice whispered through his mind once more. "You have done what no other would. You have freed me." Davor swallowed, his heart pounding. He had no idea what he had just unleashed. Vilessa's body trembled against him, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The energy that had pulsed through her chains now lingered in the air, dissipating like mist. Yet something told Davor that whatever magic bound her had not fully vanished. It had only shifted, redirected, toward him. She was free, but the weight of her existence pressed against his mind, against his very soul. Slowly, she lifted her head, her silver eyes locking onto his. Up close, her features were even more mesmerizing, sharp yet delicate, a fusion of alien grace and something strangely human. Her lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but she hesitated, her gaze flickering down to where his hands still gripped her arms. Davor realized he was holding her far too close. Heat rushed to his face, and he stepped back, letting her go. She stood unsteadily, as if unused to her own movement, her fingers brushing against the now empty space where the shackles had once been. "You've been down here for a long time," Davor said, breaking the silence. Vilessa's gaze lingered on him before she responded, her voice slipping into his mind as smoothly as a whisper. "Longer than you can imagine." The way she said it sent a chill through him. His eyes flicked around the cavern. Now that the chains were gone, the space felt different, as if it had been holding its breath for centuries and had finally exhaled. The walls still pulsed with faint blue light, but it was subdued now, almost gentle. "Why were you imprisoned?" he asked. Vilessa remained still, her expression unreadable. Then, instead of answering, she stepped past him, moving toward the cavern entrance. Her movements were slow, graceful, as if she were testing the air, the space around her. When she reached the tunnel, she turned back to him, her luminous hair drifting as though caught in an invisible current. "Take me to the surface." Davor hesitated. He had freed her on instinct, without fully considering what came next. But he couldn't just leave her here. He nodded and motioned for her to follow. As they moved through the tunnels, Vylessa's fingers trailed along the stone walls, her silver veins pulsing in response to the mine's energy. She was connected to this place in ways he didn't understand. Finally, they emerged into the open night. Vylessa inhaled sharply. The moon hung high above them, casting pale light over the landscape. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Davor watched as Vylessa stepped forward, lifting her face toward the sky. Her entire body seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, her silver eyes reflecting the vast expanse above. The sky! It is different, she murmured. Davor frowned. Different from what? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she lifted her hand, as if trying to grasp something unseen. The stars have shifted. The world has changed. Time has stretched far beyond what I knew. Her voice grew distant, almost reverent. I am the last of my kind. Something inside Davor tightened. The last, he echoed. Vylessa lowered her hand, looking at him. I was not always alone. Her words carried sorrow, but she offered no further explanation. Davor exhaled. Come inside, he said, motioning toward the old cabin. You need rest. She hesitated, glancing at the structure, then nodded. Inside, he lit an old oil lamp, casting flickering light across the wooden interior. The space was simple. A single room with a small fireplace, a cot, and shelves lined with his grandfather's journals. Vylessa moved cautiously, her fingers brushing against the furniture as if testing their solidity. Davor grabbed a blanket from a trunk and handed it to her. You should sit, he said. Vylessa accepted the fabric, though she examined it curiously before draping it over herself. She moved to the cot but did not sit. Instead, she turned her gaze to him. Why did you free me? Davor hesitated. He had asked himself the same thing. I don't know, he admitted. It felt wrong to leave you like that. Vylessa tilted her head slightly. Your bloodline has kept me here for generations. Why are you different? He didn't have an answer for that either. He shrugged. Maybe because I don't believe in keeping someone in chains. For a long moment, Vylessa studied him. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. A small, almost imperceptible curve of her lips. You are unlike them. Davor wasn't sure whether that was a compliment or not. She turned her attention to the fireplace, watching the flames dance. The light reflected in her silver eyes, making them appear even more luminous. He caught himself staring and quickly looked away, busying himself with an old kettle. You hungry? He asked. Or do you eat? Vylessa gave a small nod. I consume energy, but I can also take what sustains you. Davor wasn't sure what that meant, but he poured her a cup of tea anyway. She took it hesitantly, mimicking the way he held his own cup. When she took a sip, a flicker of surprise crossed her face. It's good, he said. Warms you up. Vylessa lowered the cup slightly, her fingers lingering around the rim. Warmth? She mused, as if the concept fascinated her. Davor watched her, unsure what to make of her reactions. So, he said, leaning against the table. Are you human? Vylessa exhaled softly, setting the cup aside. No. He waited, hoping she would elaborate. After a long pause, she spoke again. My kind was older than your people. We lived among the stars, untethered by a single world. Her silver eyes darkened slightly. We did not mean to come here, but the war left us with no choice. Davor straightened. War. She nodded. Not among ourselves. We were hunted. His pulse quickened. By who? Vylessa hesitated, then shook her head. It does not matter. They are gone now. Or perhaps, I am the one who is gone. Davor could sense the grief in her words, the weight of loneliness pressing against her. How long were you down there? He asked. Vylessa's eyes met his. Long enough to forget the sound of my own voice. His chest tightened. She had been alone for centuries, maybe longer. He couldn't fathom what that must have been like. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackling of the fire. Then, unexpectedly, Vilessa reached out, her fingers brushing against his wrist. A jolt of energy passed through him. It wasn't painful, more like the pulse of something alive, something awakening. Daver froze, his breath catching. Vilessa's expression was unreadable, but her touch was deliberate. "You freed me," she murmured. "Now we are bound." A chill ran down his spine. "What do you mean?" Vilessa withdrew her hand, her gaze dropping to where their skin had met. "I do not know." But something in her voice told him she wasn't entirely uncertain. And something inside him whispered that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Daver barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind replayed the moment Vilessa had touched him. The sensation had been unlike anything he had ever experienced. A pulse of energy that wasn't just warmth or cold but something deeper, something that resonated with him on a level he didn't understand. He lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, while Vilessa remained seated near the fire, unmoving. She didn't sleep, didn't fidget. She simply watched the flames, lost in thought. The room felt different with her in it. It wasn't just that she was alien, though that was undeniable, it was the presence she carried. She didn't belong in this small, dusty cabin any more than she had belonged in the darkness of that mine. As dawn crept through the cracks in the wooden walls, Vilessa finally stirred. "You are troubled." Her voice slid into his mind, smooth as flowing water. Daver turned his head toward her. "You could say that." He sat up, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just freed a chained alien from my family's ancient mine. Forgive me if I need a moment to process." Vilessa tilted her head, observing him in that way she always did, like she was measuring something unseen. "Do you regret it?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about it for a moment. "No," he admitted. Vilessa's expression softened just slightly. "Then what weighs on you?" Daver exhaled. "I just don't know what happens next. Who put you down there? Why was my family the one keeping you locked up?" He frowned. "And what did you mean last night, when you said we were bound?" Vilessa hesitated. Then, she rose to her feet, stepping closer. The firelight illuminated her features, the iridescence of her skin, the way her silver eyes swirled with endless motion. "The chains that held me were more than metal," she said. "They were tied to the blood of your ancestors. They were shaping my prison." Daver nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured that much. But if I broke them, doesn't that mean you're free?" Vilessa studied him. "I am free of my chains. But something else was set in motion the moment you touched them." Daver's fingers twitched at his sides. "Something else." She reached toward him again, and this time he didn't pull away. Her fingertips grazed his forearm, and the pulse returned. Stronger this time. A thread of warmth wove through him, curling deep in his chest, as if something unseen had just tightened around his soul. Vilessa's expression was unreadable. "My fate was tied to your bloodline. When you released me, the bond did not break. It shifted." Daver swallowed. "Shifted how?" Vilessa's fingers trailed away, leaving a lingering hum in his skin. "You are part of it now." He let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "Great. So I didn't just free you. I signed up for something, and I don't even know what it is." Vilessa's lips twitched, almost a smile. "You act as though you had a choice." Daver shot her a look. "I don't love the sound of that." She didn't reply. Instead, she turned toward the window, watching the first light of morning filter through the trees. Then suddenly her body tensed. Daver noticed it immediately. "What?" Vilessa's silver eyes darkened. "Something is coming." Daver was on his feet in an instant. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You were not the only one who felt my chains break." A cold weight settled in his gut. The air outside shifted. The wind, which had been still moments ago, now howled through the trees. Shadows flickered unnaturally at the edges of the cabin's windows. Vilessa stepped toward the door, her posture suddenly tense, alert. Davor grabbed his grandfather's old rifle from the wall. Not that he was sure it would do anything against whatever was out there. Who are we dealing with? Vylessa's gaze remained locked on the door. The ones who hunted my kind. Davor's grip tightened around the rifle. I thought you said they were gone. Vylessa's voice was quiet. I said I was the last. But I was not forgotten. A deep, unnatural sound echoed through the forest, like the growl of something that had never belonged to this world. Davor's blood ran cold. Vylessa turned to him, stepping closer. You freed me. Her silver eyes locked onto his. Now you must decide. Will you stand with me? Davor's pulse thundered in his ears. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, heavier than anything he had ever faced. And yet, deep in his bones, he already knew his answer. He exhaled, steadying himself. I'm with you. Vylessa's lips parted slightly, surprise, perhaps, or something else. Then, without hesitation, she reached for him. The moment their hands met, a surge of energy exploded between them, and outside, the shadows began to move. The cabin trembled as the darkness outside stirred. Davor could feel the air growing thick, charged with something unnatural. The shadows didn't behave like normal ones. They writhed, stretched, watched. Vylessa's fingers tightened around his, her silver eyes flickering with an otherworldly light. They have waited for this moment. Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something fierce. Davor swallowed hard, gripping his rifle tighter. Waited for what? Vylessa turned her gaze toward the door, where the wood creaked as if under unseen pressure. For me to be unchained. For me to be vulnerable. A deep, guttural sound vibrated through the walls. Davor took an instinctive step closer to her, his pulse hammering. Then we fight. Vylessa's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face before she nodded. We fight. The door exploded inward. Darkness poured in, not like smoke, but like liquid void shifting, slithering, alive. From within it, shapes began to take form. Elongated figures with twisting limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Davor raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, but the bullet passed through the nearest creature as if it wasn't even there. Damn it! Vylessa stepped in front of him. She raised her hand, and the silver in her veins pulsed, responding. A wave of energy rippled from her fingertips, slamming into the advancing figures. The darkness recoiled, hissing, but it did not retreat. It knew her. It wanted her. Davor gritted his teeth. Tell me there's a way to stop them. Vylessa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned toward him. The glow beneath her skin flickered erratically, as if something inside her was waking up. Something ancient, something powerful. There is a way, she said, voice quieter now. But you may not survive it. Davor didn't hesitate. Then let's do it. A shadow lunged. Vylessa moved in a blur, her energy slashing through the void like a blade. The creature screamed, dissolving into nothing. But there were more, too many. Davor stayed close to her, dodging what he could, slamming his rifle into anything that got too close. But he could feel it, the darkness was learning. They wouldn't last long. Vylessa turned, reaching for him again. But this time, when their hands met, the energy that surged between them wasn't just a pulse. It was a flood. Davor gasped as a rush of heat and cold and light consumed him. He could feel her, see her memories flash in his mind. Her world before it was lost. The stars that had once been her home. And he understood. Vylessa wasn't just one of her kind. She was their last light. Their legacy had been locked in her, buried beneath chains meant to keep her weak. But now, the bond between them had shifted. He had become part of it. Part of her. Vylessa's eyes met his, wide with realization. You are the key. Before Davor could question it, she pulled him closer. Their foreheads touched, and a sudden force exploded outward. Not just from her, but from him too. Light, real, tangible light, erupted from their joined hands, carving through the darkness. The creatures shrieked as the brilliance consumed them, their forms unraveling, their hold on the world severed. The shadows recoiled, screeching as they were torn apart. The force of it sent Davor and Vilessa stumbling back, but she caught him before he could fall. Then silence. The darkness was gone. Davor blinked, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Vilessa was still holding on to him, her silver eyes locked onto his, searching. He managed a breathless laugh. That was intense. Vilessa tilted her head. You should not have been able to channel my power. Davor shrugged. Guess I'm full of surprises. She studied him, something unreadable in her gaze. Then, slowly, her fingers trailed down his arm, lingering against his pulse. We are bound now, truly. He could feel it. The connection humming between them, no longer just a remnant of her chains, but something new, something chosen. Davor swallowed. What does that mean for us? Vilessa stepped closer. The silver glow in her veins had softened now, but it was still there, still alive. She lifted her hand, brushing her fingers lightly over his jaw, tracing his skin as if memorizing it. It means, she murmured, that I will never be alone again. His chest tightened. Neither would he. Davor lifted his own hand, hesitating for only a moment before resting it against hers. Her touch was warm now, no longer just energy, no longer just alien. It was real, and in that moment he knew this wasn't just fate. It was theirs. Vilessa's lips parted slightly, and then, as if the universe itself had willed it, she closed the distance between them. The kiss was soft at first, a hesitant, lingering touch, but then it deepened, and the energy between them didn't explode this time. It melted, like two stars colliding, not in destruction, but in creation. When they finally pulled apart, the night was still. The mine was silent. The world was theirs to decide. Davor exhaled, his forehead still resting against hers. So what now? Vilessa smiled, small but real. Now we rebuild. Together.